Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 out-of-print board games. Now, to be clear here, for out-of-print games, these are games that are not currently in circulation. These are games that you cannot find on retail. You cannot find on the publisher's website or their store online. These are games that have not been available for quite some time. In the cases of some of these games, it's been several years and there is no reprint in sight. Others on this list have been out of print maybe for 10, 12, 15 months. And there's always that hope that they're just maybe in between print runs. But at the same time, they've been unavailable for long enough that I feel like they warranted making it onto this list for consideration. So without any further ado, let's move straight on to my number 10. My number 10 out-of-print board game is Copycat, designed by Friedemann Friese. And this game here, published by Rio Grande Games. Friedemann Friese, popular for his power grid games. And Friedemann Friese is such an outside-of-the-box thinker, and he usually combines and mixes and matches mechanisms very well. And I feel like that's just what he did here. And he actually decided to kind of break the fourth wall and allude to the fact that he's copying and borrowing from some established board games by titling this game Copycat. And this is a politician theme, a political themed game where players are like running for some imaginary presidency here. And basically it's a worker placement / deck building game. But in particular, the worker placement is very much like Agricola, and the deck building is very much like Dominion, two games that were very, very popular during the time when this game first came out. For the worker placement, players start with a certain amount of workers, and as the game progresses, they can add additional workers, which represent their campaign workers who are going out there and promoting their campaign for presidency. But they also have one additional action card revealed and added to the main board to add an additional worker placement spot with each round that's going forward. Unlike Agricola that's played in 14 rounds, Copycat is only played in 11, which in a way is better because it makes the game shorter. Now, when you place your worker there, all the workers on the different spots are triggered in different phases of the game. Whenever you actually trigger the worker's action, you lay the worker face down in order to indicate that you've done that action, because the actions are not necessarily triggered right then and right there. And it's really cool because players are just trying to score as many points as possible. That's really how you win the game. And once a player crosses the 95 threshold here, or once 11 rounds are played, the player with the most points is the winner of the game. Really cool. I feel like it's definitely not reinventing the wheel, because here you go and you're just basically stealing the wheel from other people. But he does give credit to the designers from these games. He even copied the mechanism from Puerto Rico, where actions that are not used on one round accrue value in future rounds to kind of incentivize players to use them later on instead of using the same actions over and over again. I think this game is very well done. It's, again, not the greatest looking game. That's something that I think is a little bit disappointing sometimes in Friedemann Friese's games. The graphic design is not necessarily for me, but it's fun. If you like worker placement, you like deck building, a game you should consider Copycat. Now we move on to my number 9. My number 9 out-of-print board game of all time, and that is Deadwood. And this game here is a Wild West worker placement city building game. And if you want to talk about Copycat, there is a little bit of copying going on, because this game is clearly influenced by Carson City, another very well done worker placement game that takes place in the Wild West and involves a city building element. This game here, however, is not round based like Carson City is. It has an open-ending endgame condition. As a matter of fact, there's 3 different potential endgame triggers. If one player loses all of their cowboys, which represents their workers, the game is over, not just for that player, but for all players. And whoever has the most points wins. If one player builds the 4 railroad tracks and eventually the train station, that triggers the game, and whoever has the most points wins. Or if all of the wanted poster tokens run out, that triggers the end of the game. And again, the player with the most points win. And I like that concept of multiple paths for triggering the end game. That's something for players who think that they're in the lead to consider as they're making their decisions. Perhaps they want to make a decision that's not quite as optimal, but will speed up the game. And if they're in the lead, that's to their advantage. And it's really cool because players start with a supply of just 3 workers that are available to them, just like in Carson City. And as the game progresses, they're retrieving more of the workers from the general supply and adding it to their ranch, which are immediately available. And if you place a worker on an already occupied place that another player put their worker on, that's going to trigger a duel. And each of your characters have different values, base values, ranging from 1 to 3, which basically tell you their chances of winning at a duel. That combined with any ammunition tokens that a player might have at their disposal, they can only play 1 per duel, are going to determine how many dice each player rolls. And then they're going to roll the dice and resolve and determine how many casualties are had. And if your character chooses to skedaddle by playing a pony token, you simply go to the abandoned hill, and eventually you could retrieve that player. But if you lose in combat, then you get buried, and that worker or that cowboy is unavailable to you for the rest of the game. But every time you trigger a duel, the game kind of punishes you by making you draw a wanted poster token, and these accumulate exponentially to subtract points from you at the end of the game. However, there are ways of going. You could go to Town Hall or to the church in order to remove these wanted posters, but you got to factor all that in, because if you have too many wanted posters at the end of the game, you're going to subtract lots of points from your total. Really cool game. My number 9 out-of-print board game of all time, Deadwood. And now we move on to my number 7, a game I've been talking about a lot lately, and that's Colosseum, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Mark Lukey. And this game here, reprinted by Tacey Minshall, players are taking on this Colosseum, and they're basically putting on theater-like performances, but they have to accrue different resources through auctions, through trades, in order to put on different events. And the events are going to score them points based on the spectators that watch them. And the spectators is accumulation of what these tiles indicate based on the quota of resources that you met for that performance. Also, season tickets that you can purchase during the upgrade phase of each round. Also, if you're able to manipulate and maneuver for a senator, a consul, or even the emperor himself to enter your Colosseum for that performance, that's going to add to your spectators, and it's going to add to the points, which give you money, which you use in future rounds in order to purchase more upgrades, purchase more resources, ultimately with the hope that on your final round you can score as much points as possible, because the scoring in this game is not cumulative. It is the highest round is your final score at the end of the game. And quite often that is your 5th and final round, and that's what you want it to be, because that gives you the best chance of winning. Really cool. This game was out of print. It was originally published by Days of Wonder. Then Tacey Minshall picked up the rights to this game, but this game has been unavailable for a very long time, and I'm starting to get the feeling that it slipped through the cracks and that Colosseum may no longer be publishing this game, or maybe not even have the rights to this game. I should say Tacey Minshall doesn't. So we'll see. But a really cool game. Maybe it'll be picked up by somebody else. Maybe Tacey Minshall will eventually reprint it once again. My number 8 out-of-print board game of all time, Colosseum. And now we move on to my number 7. My number 7 out-of-print game. And this is kind of a cheat, because there is a deluxe edition that came out recently on Kickstarter. However, it's not available on retail just yet, and I'm not sure it's ever going to be available for retail. And the original edition is definitely very much out of print, and that is Cleopatra and the Society of Architects, designed by Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Mablanc, and published by Days of Wonder Games, at least the original. I can't tell you off the top of my head who the new publisher is, but their Kickstarter successfully funded about a year ago, and I'm not sure if they've been shipped out already. Perhaps they have, but you cannot find any copies for retail, and anybody who might have them are probably selling them for an arm and a leg. And again, there's no guarantee that it will be for retail. You correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a really cool game where players are partaking in lots of different mechanisms. First of all, you got a card drafting mechanism that players are using, but it's really cool because the market of cards are shuffled half face down and half face up. So as they're revealed throughout the game, some of the cards cards are face up and some of the cards are face down. And whenever you grab cards from a market, there's 3 different markets, you got to grab all the cards from that market. And some of those cards are going to be face down and some are going to be face up. So you're doing it on the basis of how interested you are on those face down cards, or perhaps how many cards there are in total. So maybe you're willing to take a couple of garbage cards in order to have that many cards. But you got to keep all these things in mind going forward. And you're using these cards as resources that are going to allow you to build some of the different components that make up Cleopatra's palace and surrounding gardens. And each of these different features are going to score you points accordingly. And the game is triggered when 5 of the 6 different features of Cleopatra's garden and palace are completed. And it's really cool because it's not always going to be the same 5 or 6. But also throughout the game, players are taking part in this auction in order to get rid of some of their corruption tokens. Because some of the cards that you play along the way accrue corruption tokens for you. And the corruption tokens are no good. First of all, your corruption tokens are hidden. You keep them in a little pyramid-shaped screen here. And at the end of the game, you reveal it. And the player who has the most corruption at the end of the game is, quote-unquote, eaten up by Cleopatra's crocodile. Therefore, they don't even factor into the end game. So even if they have the most points, just by having the most corruption along with it, they're disqualified altogether. So that's something you want to keep in mind. You want to play cards, but you don't want to accrue too much corruption. And every opportunity you have to alleviate or relieve yourself of some corruption, you want to capitalize on it. Really cool. You get to build these sanctuaries along the garden, which is almost a little bit of a polyomino game that's taking place within the larger game. And if you make an enclosed space, that's called a sanctuary, and that sanctuary is going to heal a certain amount of corruption from you at the end of the game according to the amount of spaces that make up that sanctuary. The pieces look really cool. The board itself serves as the platform for the garden and for the palace of Cleopatra. So I find that to be a really neat idea with lots of cool 2-dimensional pieces. And again, a neat Egyptian theme. Days of Wonder made an amazing production. It looked like the new edition on Kickstarter was going to be even more beautiful, more colorful, more garish colors that stand out and pop out. And the pieces look even more fancy and high class. But at the same time, again, I'm not so sure how available that is for you. So for now, I'm considering this as an out-of-print game. And it's my number 7 out-of-print game of all time, Cleopatra and the Society of Architects. My number 6 out-of-print board game of all time is Pirates Cove, designed by Paul Randalls and Daniel Stahl, and this here published by Days of Wonder Games. And something that you'll notice, especially as you see other games that are yet to come on this list, Days of Wonder seems to be a company that lets lots of their games go out of print. And these are not bad games, folks. We had Colosseum already on the list, and Cleopatra, and now Pirates Cove. The only difference is that Colosseum and Cleopatra seem to have been picked up by other people. Pirates Cove, for whatever reason, has never been picked up by anybody else. But this is a really cool, neat game by Days of Wonders here. And basically, it's a pirate-themed game. Players each have their own player board, which represents their ship, and their ship is divided into 4 sections. You got your hull, you got your cannons, you got your sails, and you got your crew. And throughout the game, you're doing a little bit of action program selection because you got this dial here, this little wheel, that you're selecting one of the 6 different islands around the board that you're trying to go to on that turn. But players are doing this simultaneously. And then they're revealing it simultaneously. And it just so happens that quite often players end up going to the same location. Well, 2 or more players end up the same location. That's going to trigger a combat. Players are going to have the opportunity to flee. However, if they flee, they're basically going to do nothing for that turn, and they're going to grant the players who remain and who do not flee and run away, they're going to grant them victory points, so that's something to consider. But you're going to roll dice, and your combat's going to be based on the common denominator of the highest value between your cannons and your crew. So those are 2 sections you want to keep strong because you want to be able to attack and attack well. Have your fellow pirates around the seas, the 7 seas, fear you and respect you. But every time you attack, you got to choose one of the 4 sections of a player's ship that you're going to attack. And if you're able to knock it down all the way to 0, that player is forced to retreat to Pirates Cove, which is kind of like a neutral island where players just go to lick their wounds, maybe acquire a few basic resources, restore their damaged section of their ship. And basically, this is a place where pirates cannot compete and combat with one another. But it's really cool because players are trying to accrue different amounts of gold, different resources. Again, they're trying to strengthen their ships. And then they're trying to deposit these treasure chests in Treasure Island, which is another neutral island where players cannot compete with each other, albeit the artificial intelligence neutral legendary pirate ship can compete with you in Treasure Island, so that's something to consider. And you deposit the treasure there for victory points and what have you. My number 6 how to print board game of all time, Pirates Cove. And now we move on to the top 5, folks. The cream of the crop. My 5 favorite board games in my collection that happen to be out of print. And my number 5 is Android Netrunner. And Netrunner was originally a CCG by Richard Garfield. This LCG living card game here is a reimagining by Lucas Litzinger and Fantasy Flight Games. And basically it takes place within their Android universe, which is this futuristic cyberpunk dystopian universe where you have a bunch of different corporations. And in this game, one player takes on the role of the wicked or bad corporation, and the other player takes on the role of the Netrunner, the hacker who's trying to break into the server and systems of the corporation in order to steal their agendas, while the corporation is trying to advance those agendas. And whoever is able to accomplish their objective first, to a total of 7 agenda points, is going to be the winner of the game. But it's so cool because this is a very asymmetric game down to its terminology and the way the players approach the game. The Netrunner is having a much more attack-heavy based game, while the corporation has a more tactful and shrewd little game of chicken that they're playing. They're trying to make the Netrunner guess where their agendas may or may not be. And if they do so successfully, they could win. Now, this game is out of print. I do not know why. This game had a very strong cult following not too long ago. Still today has a pretty strong cult following. It has tons of expansions and booster packs that players can purchase to add to their collection. As a matter of fact, lots of the data packs, as they refer to them, are still available for retail at a very good price. However, the base game and the big box expansions are being sold at an arm and a leg, used by many other people. So there is that. But yeah, I think this game is a powerful game. Maybe it'll be reprinted again. When you think about it, Netrunner itself, the original, was not too successful and then was picked up by Fantasy Flight and turned into Android Netrunner. So we'll see what the future has in store for this game. For now, it's my number 4 or number 5 out-of-print board game of all time, Android Netrunner. Now we move on to my number 4 out-of-print board game. And this is one of those grail games of mine that from when I first got in the hobby, this game is based on one of my gateway games. It's designed by one of my favorite designers of all time. So when I heard about it, I really wanted it, but I could never find a copy for a good price. And eventually, I got a brand new shrink wrap copy. This must have been from years ago. Its last release might have been 10 years ago, I think. I got it for a really good price. All right, that's enough belaboring the point. My number 4 out-of-print board game, Carcassonne The Castle, designed by Reiner Knizia. And this is based on Carcassonne, but it's the one Carcassonne, I think there's one other actually, that's by Leo Colovini. But this is one of the 2 Carcassones that's not designed by Klaus Jürgen Wrede, the original designer of Carcassonne. And this here is a 2-player only game. And it's so cool because the game is confined within this castle. You have these wall tiles that make a surrounding area for players to focus in. And the walls also serve as a scoring track. And it's so cool because all your tiles have to go in there. So it's confined in that regard. But there's a lot of neat features. First of all, this game is not as restrictive as far as the tile placement is concerned, like Carcassonne is. Also, if you ever score points to put yourself exactly into one of the corners of the walls here on the score track, you're going to be able to pick up a special tile. And those special tiles grant you special abilities. Sometimes they allow you to score additional points in different ways at the end of the game. So they're very valuable. So sometimes you're going to map out a turn and you might give up a few points right then and right there, score fewer points by taking another action in order to land your meeple exactly onto those tiles and capitalize on those tiles. Also, at the end of the game, the player who has the biggest house, which is represented by these red symbols on some of their tiles, the player who has the biggest house is going to score points for every empty space that's within the walls. And the walls are always going to have 16 or more empty space. And as a matter of fact, they're going to score double for that, which is 32. So you're going to score at least 32 points at the end of the game if you have the biggest house. So that's a way of totally coming back from the game if you're behind. So that's something to consider as far as strategy is concerned. My number 4 out-of-print board game of all time, Carcassonne The Castle. My number 3 out-of-print board game is El Grande, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Richard Ulrich. This here is by Z-Man Games, although the original edition was published or at least distributed here in North America by Rio Grande Games. And here, as you can see, I have the big box expansion, which includes 5, or the big box edition, which includes 5 expansions. I've played 2 out of these expansions. And this is the pioneer, the grandfather of all area control, area majority games as we know them today. Basically, the board consists of a map of Spain. Sometimes the expansions to the board add Portugal as an explorable region. They might even add the Americas and North Africa and South France even. And players are trying to place their meeples, which represent their caballeros, into these different regions in order to have the majorities there. And all the different regions score you differently depending on its value. But the regions will also score you points if you have the second most in that region as well. And if you're playing at a certain player count, 4 or more, then you'll even score points for having the third most caballeros in that place. Really, really cool game. At the beginning of each round, you're taking part in an auction for turn order, which I always love that as a mechanism. And then after that, you're drafting different action cards that grant you abilities. Some of the more higher valued action cards grant you more caballeros to place down, but no abilities on top of that, or a very meager ability. Some of the lower value cards only allow you to place 1 caballero, but they grant you a very cool, interesting, game-changing ability right then and right there. And this game here has been in print for so long. This game was a Spiel des Jahres winner back in 1996, originally published in 1995, I believe, by Hans im Gluck. And I cannot believe that after consistently being in print for so long, and even after Rio Grande dropped it, Z-Man picked it up, that for whatever reason, it's been over a year since I've seen this game be available. And this game is still ranked in the top 100 on BGG, so take that with a grain of salt. This game is still highly regarded, and the people who do end up going back to it see its classic status, that although there's lots of new modern looking games, this game still holds its own within the current market. But for whatever reason, again, it's currently out of print. I'm hoping that this is just temporary, although it has been a long time. And I'm hoping soon this game will be available to the larger public, so that when I do suggest it, I can put a link down below for people to purchase it and actually find it for a good price. My number 3 out-of-print board game of all time, El Grande. And now we move on to my number 2 out-of-print game. And this game, again, Days of Wonder, folks. That is Yamatai, designed by Bruno Cathala and Mark Pakian here. And this here, again, by Days of Wonder, it's a Japanese-themed game. And this is very much considered to be a spiritual successor to 5 Tribes. And it's a very different game. The commonality is these special characters that players are purchasing throughout the game. You had the jinns or genies in 5 Tribes that granted you special powers, abilities right then and there, and at the end of the game granted you victory points. Here in Yamatai, you have these specialists, and it's the same thing as far as them granting you these powers and these victory points at the end of the game. However, this game borrows that Puerto Rico mechanism that I alluded to earlier on this video, where whenever something is not purchased right then and there, that round, on the future round, you're going to add value to it. You're going to add some coins onto those specialists that have not been purchased in order to incentivize players to draft or acquire those specialists that have lots of money on it. And you're placing down ships. You're buying these different ships that represent different resources, whether it's gold or it's bamboo or wood or clay or stone, all these different ships, and they're color coded, and you're placing them along the different lines of the routes here, and you're doing one of two things on your turn. You're either drafting these special culture tokens that come in one of 5 different colors: purple, red, orange, green, and blue, and at the end of your turn you can turn in 2 of the same color or 3 of unique colors in order to purchase one of these specialists that I mentioned earlier. That's one of the things you could do in your turn. If you choose not to do that, instead, if you have an empty island along the route of ships that you just placed down, then you can build a building there. And there's these building tokens or pieces that you have in your tableau, in your player area, that you place down there. However, there's these building tiles in the market that determine which buildings you're actually purchasing, what resources, what ships need to surround that island, what particular combination of ships, and how many victory points you're going to have at the end of the game for doing so. Now, if you're able to build a network or a cluster of buildings of your own that you built there, you're going to exponentially benefit from that. Also, if you're able to build these Torii or palace pieces, these special buildings, they're going to score you lots of points. And if you're able to build some of your buildings adjacent to them, you're going to be rewarded with prestige tokens, which at the end of the game will grant you additional points. A little bit of a point salad, very much like 5 Tribes. And it does have a neat element as far as determining turn order, because there's not an auction as there is in 5 Tribes, but instead you kind of have the king domino mechanism here, where you choose these tiles at the beginning of the game that grant you a particular ship for free, or perhaps 2 or more ships, and B, in many cases, they grant you a special action. And the lower valued tiles here, action tiles here, are going to get you less ships and less interesting actions. However, they're going to give you priority in turn order for the upcoming round. The more higher valued ships, that tiles here that have lots of ships or more valuable ships or really cool, neat, game-changing actions, they're also going to make sure that you're going to be towards the back in turn order come the next round. So again, that's something to consider going forward. Do you want a really good decision or a really good choice, but put yourself perhaps in a bad position next turn? Perhaps you want 2 mediocre tiles in order to kind of have yourself in the middle of the pack as far as turn order. I say 2 tiles because if you play 2 players, you draft 2 tiles. If you play 3 or more players, you actually only draft 1 tile. But I like this mechanism in games. I like it in King Domino, and I like it here in Yamatai. This whole factoring in your next turn and the turn order you want for the next round. Really cool, really neat. This game just combines lots of things. It's a beautiful looking game. Again, for whatever reason, Days of Wonders, they focus on few games, so they tend to drop out of games really quickly if they don't, I guess, meet their high success standards. And I guess Yamatai didn't do that. But in my case, my number 2 out-of-print board game of all time, Yamatai. And finally, we move to my number 1. And my number 1, another Grail game, just like Carcassonne The Castle earlier, a game that I looked into for quite a while and finally was able to find it at a really good price. And that is Runebound 2nd edition. And I know I talk a lot about this game on this channel. This is a Fantasy Flight themed game based on the Terranoff universe, and Runebound is the flagship pioneer game within that universe. Players take on the role of different heroes, and they're going on these different quests and adventures and challenges throughout the lands of Terranoff, going to the cities in order to partake in shopping, purchase weapons, armors, items, spells, and allies who are going to help them combat against all these different monsters and ultimately defeat the big bad, the overlord, the High Lord Dragon Margath. Now, this game here, the 2nd edition, is massively out of print. I could have even included Runebound 3rd edition, which I also enjoy in this list, because it too is out of print. But Runebound 2nd edition, unlike 3rd edition, has lots of content out there for it. As a matter of fact, at this point, I already own most of the content out there for it. I found it, I've been very thrifty about it, and I've been able to purchase these expansions for a very good price. Now, albeit It's definitely not what the games costed when they were available for retail back in the day. But the thing about Runebound is that if there's any game in my list that is massively out of print, it's Runebound 2nd edition. This game is never going to be reprinted again, ever, ever, ever. Even Runebound 3rd edition was technically a different game. It did borrow lots of the concepts and mechanisms from Runebound, but it changed it drastically at the same time. And if Fantasy Flight were ever to revisit that property again, I'm pretty sure that you would have something like Runebound 4th edition, and it would be a drastic difference. Although I don't even imagine there being a 4th edition to Runebound. So for the time being, if you can find yourself a cheap copy of 2nd or 3rd edition, you should look into it. But this game here, I just have so much fun playing it. You can play it solo. You can play it competitively, anywhere from 2 to 4 players. Again, lots of variety. And it's just a game that puts me in a good place, in a good zone. Not too sure why Fantasy Flight dropped it and decided to produce 3rd edition, although I am one of those rare people that actually enjoys 3rd edition as well. I do think that it is the inferior one of the two, and most people are in the camp of Runebound 2nd edition. So again, it baffles me as to why Fantasy Flight would have gone in that direction of not reprinting this. Perhaps they couldn't get the rights from Martin Wallace. I'm not too sure about all the ins and outs as far as that's concerned, but I know that you're never going to find this game again available on retail. My number 1 out-of-print board game of all time, Runebound 2nd edition. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what's your favorite out-of-print board game of all time. Tell me what you think about my list. Perhaps you have some inside information and know that I'm wrong about some of these games being out of print. I will be glad to be corrected. Please leave those comments down below, and I'm definitely going to be reading them later on. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.